That's the phone, very small, I should have told you.
Okay.
I'll be great.
All right, we ready? Okay, we will call the Low Barrier Homeless Shelter Task Force meeting to order, October 26, 2022. We are coming from the Indiana Government Center, South Conference Room 12, Cardinal Hall. So first of all, thank you for everyone attending both live and online. We'll start off by roll of the task force members. And when we do this, could you please state your name and location as we go through a roll call? So those present will be live, and then those that are not present will be, just note that you're online.
Yes, sir, recorded.
And just to confirm, this meeting is being recorded. So I will start off, Tom McGowan, in person at the Government Center.
Jeff Bennett in person.
Jennifer Layton in person.
Senator Jack Sandlin in person.
Matt Rayburn with IHCEA in person.
Corey Carey with FSSA in person.
Jacob Syke with IHCDA in person.
Chris Plessinger, Department of Correction in person.
Matthew Catulo, State Senator, Center District 30 in person.
Thank you. Could we do the roll call of anyone online now, please?
Chelsea Herring Cozy, Chip joining via Teams.
Yes, no, I frequently think of that's one.
Skylar Wood, Legislative Assistant to Representative Ledbetter, and I am here in the State House.
Yeah, do you want me to send you a digital copy over to that? Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, could we ask anyone that is not speaking to please put your line on hold, please?
Tim Brown's just joined us.
Tim, are you with us? Could you, note your name and location, please? Tim, are you?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, Tim Brown, remote.
Okay, anyone else that, go ahead, sorry.
Yep, Tom, this is Chelsea. Cade Ryan is an intern with Chip, and I've asked him to join, just listening in today.
Okay, we appreciate that. So thank you for everybody working through the roll call. Next, next on the agenda is the approval of the September 29th, 2022 meeting minutes. If there's any discussion, happy to go through that. Otherwise, I will entertain a motion for approval. Okay. We have a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second. I would now ask, we have to go through the same roll call. So all those in favor of approval, please state aye, name and location, please.
Aye, Jeff Bennett in person.
Jack Sandlin, I in person.
Matt Rayburn, I in person.
Corey Carey, I in person.
Jacob Syke, I in person.
Chris Plessinger, I in person.
Matthew Catulo, I in person.
Could I also request approval from those that are online, please? Please state your name and location.
Chelsea Herring Cozy on Teams, aye.
Tim Brown on Teams, aye.
Hey, Tim, could you do us a favor just because of feedback? When you're not speaking, do you mind putting your phone on mute, please? Thank you. Anyone else?
Rick Alvis. Yeah, Rick Alvis. Aye.
Thank you, Rex. Is that it, Mike?
Yeah, Rick might be feedback, but.
Okay. Okay. Based upon the roll, meeting minutes are approved. Our next meeting agenda, we're fortunate to have Jennifer Layton and she is the president and CEO of the famous Lafayette facility that this group has talked about many times. I will say that I took a tour with Jennifer and her team and a group from Indianapolis, including IMPD, and a host of others, city, et cetera. And it really is it's a fabulous facility. And so we would love to hear from you, Jennifer. And I know you're aware of what our tasks are as a group, and it plays into what we're trying to do. And Jeff and I spoke about this last night, that what we'd like to do is have an agenda as part of the report that deals with short-term objectives, meaning things that we can do immediately. You know, Jeff uses the term, what can we pull off by spring of 2023? So we're gonna, hopefully as a task force, lay out what are the immediate items that we can attack. But then there's also the long-term goal of addressing this low barrier shelter complex. But we don't want to lose sight of the fact we got a lot to do prior to a structure like that being built in 2 or 3 years, because all these things take time. So it would be great if you could give this great committee a presentation of your group. And I'll tell you one thing that I would love to hear that Jeff and I talked about last night is the definition for all of us of low barrier. I think I know it, but I told Jeff, you know, I'm not sure I fully understand it, and I think Jeff would tell you.
Varies from person to
Yeah,
person.
right. Yeah, so we'll turn it over to you, but thank you for being here.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I will tell you that I've been in this field for almost 30 years. Like, I know Jake when we were both young children, starting out in our careers. And honestly, what I've learned over the last 28 years is that all human beings deserve housing. And I see what happens when they don't have housing. And every day I look out my window and I see people that are laying on the sidewalks that don't have housing. So I come to you today to talk about who we are, what we do, and the vision and the mission that we have. And that is really to develop housing opportunities for people that need it the most. So at LTHC, we do a variety of different types of programming. We are the coordinated entry for our region, which means anybody who is facing an adversity to housing is able to come to our 24/7 engagement center and have an assessment done where we talk with people about their housing situation. Our ultimate goal is to try to divert everyone out of homelessness, keep them housed where they are. If we can mediate, if we can find friends and family to put people, whatever we can do, if we can send people home to where they have a housing solution, we provide bus tickets, train tickets, whatever we need to do, because people do better with housing. Unfortunately, that's not always an option. And so there are people that literally have no place to go. So with that being said, several years ago, we worked on developing an opportunity in Lafayette because we, in 2012, with the help of IHCDA and the Corporation for Supportive Housing, we had what they called a charrette, which was a 1-week strategic planning process for our community to think about how we were siloed into doing our different programs and into how to change that from a silo into a system. And so that's really what got the momentum in Lafayette to make changes. We have since created a 24/7 opportunity for any person that has no housing to come to our LTHC Engagement Center. At that location is where we do the coordinated intake, but we also provide on-site supportive services. So we make sure people have access to meals, restrooms, showers, laundry. We have lockers available, medication lockers, charging stations, things that people need to have in order to survive. That's what we do there. For those that have no shelter solution, we have one emergency shelter in our community that's for single individuals, but it is not a low barrier shelter. So not all individuals are able to be accepted into that location. So on site of our location, we do have a low barrier shelter for up to 10 people. That is not enough. We knew when we designed the facility that would not be enough, but it was at least better than nothing. Our goal is to find permanent housing solutions for people that are unhoused. That's our goal. So we have a variety of programs. We do rapid rehousing programs. We have a program for families, a program for single individuals, and a program for veterans. We offer permanent supportive housing. We have programs for individuals. We have programs for couples. We have programs for families. But what we do know is that people need a safe place to be in order to prepare them for their housing solution, meaning securing needed documents. That takes forever for some people. When people have no housing, they don't have access to their ID, their social security cards, and certainly not their birth certificates. And so in order to qualify for many of these programs, it takes time. And it also takes support. So at LTHC, we have case managers that actually work with people on their housing stability plans. Each person gets a plan. We work with them to develop what they need and what that intention looks like for whatever solution they want to have. During the same time, we also do a health assessment plan. Many of the folks with whom we work don't have appropriate health care. We have folks that have severe mental health issues, active substance use disorder, chronic health challenges, and many times the trifecta of all of the above. These are folks that many of them don't have any type of income. They have poor rental history. I mean, it's like every barrier known, right? They have criminality. That's a great one, right? And so for people that have all of these barriers, it's really easy for them to fall into despair. They're in the midst of a traumatic event, and there are no easy solutions. So when we created the Engagement Center, we did it intentionally to develop a space to include partnerships on site, because it takes a village. And we wanted to be the experts in housing, but we needed to pull in our partners to help with the other areas that are barriers to our folks. So we have significant partnerships with the healthcare industry. We have our local health department. They are on site. They provide their syringe exchange program. We have many different types of healthcare providers that come on site. We have a medical clinic that's on site that's now staffed 2 days a week. We also, well, let me back up a little bit. We moved in January 2020. So January 2020, on Martin Luther King Day was the day we moved in. We wanted to build a structure where everyone came in. We were all under one roof. Like, let's all sing Kumbaya together. And then in March of 2020, everybody get out. We have no idea what we're doing. Because honestly, with COVID, especially when it first came out, when they gave the high-risk population, I literally thought every one of my clients were going to die. And it was horrible. It was absolutely horrible. So at that point was when we worked very closely with our partners, with IHCDA, with our local United Way. We needed to come up with flexible funding to get our folks out of congregate shelter and into immediate hotel placement. That worked wonderfully until we couldn't find the next step of housing. We didn't have great housing solutions for people. So we did a good job mitigating COVID and mitigating people contracting COVID, but we continued to find barriers to housing solutions. One of the things we did at our location was we created the 10 emergency crisis beds, but we also have another housing opportunity, which we call interim housing. And interim housing, we have 17 pods, is what we call them, for people that have a housing opportunity within 45 days or less. Many times we have found that people are able to secure, maybe they're able to secure a housing opportunity, but it's going to be in 4 weeks when the unit's actually ready. Like it takes time for all the things to line up. So interim housing allowed us to pull people out of the emergency shelter, free up those beds for other folks, pull people out of our emergency shelter, free up those beds, and give people an opportunity. And this pod was their pod. They didn't check in and check out. It was their pod for 45 days. Now, we do have a contract with people that says, I understand this is my placement and I'm going to continue to work on my housing plan, but I can keep my belongings here safe. We have some lockable storage in those pods for people, and they have access to that every night. So it opens up at 8:30 PM and then it closes at 7:30 AM. We're all in one facility. It's literally down a hallway. So the night shelter opens at night, the day resource center opens during the day. Also in the day resource center, we have our community mental health center has staffing on site. So they're there to provide therapeutic opportunities, case management opportunities, enrollment and entitlement benefits, anything that they can do. We have a partnership with our local Mental Health America where they have their healthcare navigator on site. So they're helping people secure health insurance. Many of our folks don't have that. Our case managers help people get their food stamps and all those types of things through those entitlement benefits. And so really what we do is we help people connect to any kind of benefit that they can use that will ultimately secure them into a housing solution. Now, many people across the country will talk about the fact that it's really hard when there are several different groups kind of all working in the same vein. Ending homelessness for one person. Sometimes our clientele have multiple case managers. And so we wanted to get rid of that. Our clients don't need to answer to more than one person. Like that's just way too much. If any of you ever have any healthcare issues and you know the multiple doctors you have to deal with, like I've got that going on now, like we all have to be on the same page. It's just a lot. It just makes your event even worse. And so again, we were intentional about, okay, let's have a contact person. When we're doing case conferencing about people, we're looking at our prioritized list and we figure out who's the most vulnerable and we try to figure out what kind of housing solution and what support goes with that housing solution. We know that we don't have enough housing resources for all the people that are at my place. We don't. And so we have to prioritize those that have the highest need into the most appropriate solution that we have available to them at that time. We only have 99 units of permanent supportive housing right now. We're looking at expanding that to 40 more units. We know that that's not enough. We know that we have emergency housing vouchers. That's an opportunity through the federal government right now for people that are highly vulnerable. We have 15 people right now that have a voucher in hand that are unable to find a landlord to participate with them. I'm a huge Purdue fan, boiler up, but that does cause some issues with housing and our housing style. There's no place across the country that has the appropriate number of low-income housing units available with the people that need it. And so unfortunately, we will always have this revolving door and it's a struggle. But I will say, when we all came together as a community to talk about how we could make a difference, it changed the narrative in Lafayette. Was everyone pleased? No. No, like not everybody was always on the same page. But we did it with the lived expertise of our people. We had them at the table when we made decisions and we had discussions. We brought clientele to the table to find out what the barriers were. We also want to know, and we do that again with intention for every project that we work on. I know what I would want, but I've never actually experienced homelessness. I learned from them. Like that's the lens I work through. So I always want to hear from them. Like, what can we do different? What can we do better? There's always opportunities for changes, even today. Like there's still things that we need to do different. But making an opportunity that's low barrier, meaning we're not doing credit checks on people when they come in. We're not doing criminal background checks on people when they come in. We don't do sobriety checks when people come in. We are here for people. They are able to come as they are. Now, is there a standard of behavior that needs to come alongside them? Yes. If they don't behave appropriately, are they asked to leave? Yes. But we have a progressive disciplinary policy. It really depends on the severity of the issue. But we also train all of our staff on de-escalation, mental health first aid, understanding, again, that our clientele at this point in time are literally living their worst life. They're angry, they're tired, they've literally just pooped on the sidewalk, some of them. Like they are, sorry to be so blunt, but this is what they know. And so when they come in and they're told that there's a line for the bathroom, that escalates. When they come in and they're told that they missed lunch, because, you know, they're not living by their iPhone and their watch, and they don't have all of these things. That explodes behavior sometimes. We also are working with people that have some very substantial mental health issues that are not being cared for, some of which are being self-cared for by other means of substance use. And so that's really creating a lot of destruction and despair for people. What we know is that when we utilize housing first, that is our housing first philosophy, which is low barrier. We don't really care that you've got all this going on. Like, we understand that you're in the midst of this awful situation that you're in. We want you to get into housing. And it takes a minute, a year, 2 years, because we're going to continue to ask you about care. We never fire a client from care. Now, they can fire us. They do try to fire us. But we're kind of annoying in that way, that we just continue to ask. Because there will be a day when they say, today's the day. But people have to get used to being in the housing. Many of our folks, when they first get into a permanent housing opportunity, they will still have all their belongings in their backpack. They don't sleep in the bed. We do housing checks once a month. Like, we check the apartments, and we notice that they're not living their life in an apartment. So that's one of the things we work on, is we help people get comfortable in housing, help make sure they understand that they are safe. For our permanent supportive housing, we work with eviction prevention plans and housing retention plans. We're not just a landlord. Like, if you're late with your rent, or if you've got your music got too loud, or we're not going to go to eviction. We first start with our housing retention plan. We have a discussion. What can we do? How can we help? This is an issue. We have a conversation with the tenant. We find out what's going on. Now, it's up to the tenant to participate and either make some changes or not, and that's on them. And then if those things don't get better, we then go to eviction prevention plan. That's when the rubber's meeting the road. So here, like, let's talk the talk and walk the walk at the same time. Many times that gets people's attention. We rarely have to do an actual eviction, because we want to make sure we're doing all we can. Because if someone doesn't secure housing with us and retain that housing with us, nothing good will come from that, because there's no other landlord. I mean, it's a challenge for us to secure landlords to participate with us in our programs. And ultimately, that's really because of misperceptions about people who are experiencing homelessness, or reality. If they've had someone that was experiencing homelessness and maybe they've worked with us and the tenant continued with their behaviors or didn't pay their rent or whatever the case looks like. So we try to do a really good job on working with our landlords, because we need them. We need them to be partners with us. But we also focus on low barrier, and that's a real struggle for many people to understand, right?
Yeah.
I hear that a lot. I hear that a lot from people that drive by my building. Lots of people on Facebook have lots of things to say, all the things, yeah. But we believe that housing is healthcare. That until someone gets housing, they cannot work on any of the challenges they've had before. And so we give people an opportunity once they finally get into housing, but it takes forever. And so while they're in that waiting period of trying to find a housing solution, things don't get better. We try, we connect people, we send lots of people to opportunities of treatment and rehab and all the things, but until they have a place when they're being discharged out of the system of care. We have 4 medical respite beds at our location as well. But again, we don't have that next step of just an empty building that has an opportunity for people. So we help people connect to care, we help people get their needs met, but ultimately without that final housing solution, many times we see them right back in the system. I would welcome any of you to come to Lafayette. I would love to show you around.
If you get a chance, I'll tell you, it's worth going there, and that's what got my mind going on this whole thing. And, but that was great. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you for your presentation. So why don't we open it up for questions
Sure.
now?
Could you give a just
sort of a quick rundown of your budget. So one of the things we're trying to do as a task force is identify where there are funding gaps in the system. And so for permanent supporting housing, we've had that conversation and we've given ICD's participation, discussion of continuum of care funding and housing tax credits. But for day center, shelter, emergency beds, medical respite beds, the temporary pods, how are those developed? And then how do you fund the operation?
So developed, we were intentional with the facility. It's a 3-story facility. The top 2 floors of the building were funded through a low-income housing tax credit. It is a project, it's 40 units. The first floor is our engagement center, medical respite, interim housing, and we were funded from that through a private philanthropy, a private foundation, a healthcare foundation in our community. And one of the things when we made the pitch to that healthcare foundation was that we checked all the boxes, what they really wanted to do with their allocation. They wanted to help people that had severe mental health issues. They wanted to help people that had substance use disorder. They wanted to help people with chronic health challenges. We checked all the boxes because these are the people. And so they made a very significant investment of $4 million into the facility. So that was fantastic. Like that's really what we needed to get it going. Now, as far as operating, that's when we get a little sketchy, right? So operating, there's not great ongoing funding for operating. So
I do recall that.
so we struggle with this a lot. This is something that if people understood the depth and breadth of what that really does, everyone should fund it. But it's not a solution, right? Like it's not a long-term solution for people. So people have a harder time buying in. We do get a very minuscule amount of emergency solution grant funding that pays for operations. We receive from our medical respite, we have received some medical types of funding, but that is one of the things that we're really trying to focus on is getting our healthcare providers to see the significant financial impact of medical respite versus emergency care, which we are starting to prove. But for the actual day-to-day engagement center, that's a rough one. And so one of the things that we are constantly doing is talking with folks, our donors. We've got private philanthropy, we've got donors, we've got our local United Way. Again, they were part of that initial conversation back in 2012 that wanted to make this change in how we did business. So they are significant funders in the operations. And those are really the long-term, it's tough.
So Jennifer, would there be a way that you could share with this commission if you cannot? Obviously, no problem, but I know we covered a lot of these in our meeting when we were in Lafayette. But if it is available, if we could kind of see the capital stack of the funding and then operations, it would be great. It would be great for this commission to have all that information.
How would, we're in the process of having conversations about FSSA applying for this waiver for reimbursement for services. So I mean, because I think
Just got a tear in my eye.
I think the point with that question was that while that's important to us here in Indianapolis that are working on this, it's for you and Bloomington's got a shelter, like it would be a huge
It's critical.
component of helping others,
Literally critical.
right?
Yes.
Bloomington's
Which is a statewide issue then. So it's not just, so when we get into the state house, it's a statewide issue.
What would that waiver look like? And what are the details of it? I'm just curious, because I know we can talk about a waiver very generally, but really, if we get to the root of it, what is it that impacts your operations dollars that waiver can provide? And be very, very specific. What is it that, because you offer an array, you work with a variety of folks in housing, in different housing solutions. So where is the waiver? What if we could make 3 changes? What are those 3 changes that would have the biggest impact?
No pressure, Jake, thanks.
But you know what? That's very, we talked about this yesterday. As part of our ultimate commission report, we gotta be specific as hell. We can't just,
We can.
yeah, as best we can. Okay.
So I would say the day-to-day case management type of opportunities, we've got many folks that aren't securing through their community mental health center. Maybe they've got bad blood, maybe they don't have a mental health issue or substance use disorder. So these are still life skills that we're working on with people. So those are case managers that are actually doing that work. Those are unfunded through that program.
Yeah.
Even our guest services, like we're providing for people's basic needs. We're allowing people to use the showers and the restroom and the laundry. We're teaching people how to do laundry. We're providing meals for people. We get no meal subsidy. You know, if there's schools or prisons, like there's other opportunities to pay for that. We get nothing from any of that. So I don't know what that could look like. I'm not a Medicaid reimbursement. That's not what we do because I'm going to be the housing piece, right? I'm the housing person. But I certainly do hear from my partners that do get Medicaid reimbursement that there's challenges to that. And that not all people are qualifying for the care pack that they need that will get them in that bucket of funding. I need that to lessen up. I need that to be much more open for people that need the help the most. They're not the ones that are checking all of those boxes, though they need the resources.
Yeah.
So last Friday, I spent the day at the convention center for the mental health conference summit that was convened by Chief Justice Rush from the Supreme Court.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
there were approximately 1,000 people. All 92 counties were represented. There were legislators, there were judges, there were public defenders, there were prosecutors, corrections people, sheriffs, pretty much across the board, but about 1,000 people representing 92 counties. And so Jay Shadrack from the State Department of Health spoke about funding, and one of the things that they are working on relating to mental health is a Medicaid waiver, and that will look at reimbursements. I just have to tell you that as I said and listened to a lot of that conversation, I was thinking about, you know, this group and some of the challenges with funding. Justice Goff from the State Supreme Court has been appointed by Justice Rush to kind of spearhead this. I've been sitting on the committee since October of 19, you know, where we've looked at around the country. I think that in the legislature next year, funding, particularly for mental health, is going to be a priority. We have the new 988 suicide prevention line that's come on, and there's discussion on how to generate revenue that could be specifically targeted toward mental health. So I do think there's some opportunities coming down the road, and there is already an in-depth discussion about a Medicaid waiver, and that's got to come through FSSA. But you know, I understand that they're engaged in the conversation.
That's correct.
Yeah.
I have heard that that is the legislative priority. I just didn't know in what form that would come. But
Well, I just say that at the conference, we had Justice Rush and others from the state courts, and we had the governor who spoke, and the president pro tem and the speaker of the House. And so the three
we got
branches
a lot
of
of energy.
government
Yeah,
came together
That's correct.
to make that a priority.
That's great.
I will just say that, actually Matt and I both serve on an FSSA. They've now created a subgroup about housing initiatives because there is so much of a direct connection about people suffering from mental health and their challenges with housing as well. Like, we're all going hand in hand. Like, it's really a puzzle to solve, but
Yeah.
like, just don't forget about the housing piece.
And do you feel like the recommendations in the IHCBA, Medicaid, House Walk report are actionable? I mean, are those the right recommendations for what Jennifer's talking about?
I think some of that's the place to start, for sure. I think we want to be, continue to maybe have a little more specificity on some of this report, but it's a good starting point to look at the crosswalk recommendations. I know we talked about those just a little bit at the last task force meeting as well, but part of it is what are the activities that the Medicaid can pay for, and part of it is who are the organizations that Medicaid can reimburse, right? Because most of the Medicaid, all the MRO funding under Indiana's rule can only go to the community mental health centers. And some of our areas, the community mental health centers are either tapped or have not bought into supportive housing and housing first. And those become little desert areas where these services aren't happening.
And
So
then
they really
we've
do
heard-
expand.
Then we've heard, well, you know, the waivers are in place and others can apply beyond just the community mental health centers. There is a lack of expertise in how to do that.
how to do the bill.
Yeah, how to actually do
Right,
the.
there are organizations doing great services that can't turn around and get funded.
Right.
If the gate was to open for them, we would need to bring statewide technical assistance on. Congrats, you can now bill Medicaid. What is that? look
What
like?
is that?
Track it, how do we do the bill?
Yeah, I mean, it also, it sounds so complex every time we talk about it. It makes you wonder, are there consulting groups that help put things like this together for states to understand how to navigate this? It just seems like everyone I've spoken to are kind of put their hands up like, how the hell do we do
I mean,
this?
of all the programs, Medicaid is.
Yeah, so I just wonder, as a state, as
The
a
most
group,
generous, but the
is
most.
there a, you know, the
Yeah.
best consultancy group out there that could maybe help us all understand the best way to do this, and then legislatively as well?
And there are states that have done this, and have
Been successful.
granted the waivers. and-
Good.
And they have the best of the best in working with them to set that exactly.
Oh, good. Great.
I think, so, not to get too far ahead, but I think we may want to devise a recommendation that actually, I think, deals with the complexity of Medicaid billing. Once we succeed in getting the waivers that we need. You know, I've had some service providers say, yeah, I'm gonna have to add more staff to be able to bill Medicaid. And so like, what is the juice worth the squeeze? Well, maybe there's a way to sort of help sort through that with statewide, service providers across the state.
I'd also like to just jump in
Yeah.
for one other area of expertise that we have found over the last couple of years are our peer supports.
Yeah.
That has been critical. Community health workers, certified recovery specialists, peers, any way I can pay for any of them to do work on our place, it's fantastic. So again, we're begging and borrowing from everywhere in order to pay them.
Can I ask just a couple more sort of programmatic questions?
Sure.
Do you bring in, like, for document gathering, do you bring in agencies like BMV to on-site, or are you still sort of sending people out to go get a birth certificate at the health department and go get a social security card? And
So, so for the BMV specifically, we do have an official letter that we can send with the guest to the BMV. So that is still one that we have to send someone. It's often difficult for them to make that happen. Social Security, we actually have a retired Social Security staff person that comes on site and provides services. She's critical. I hope she never leaves. It's unbelievable the things that she can do and the system she can navigate. Absolutely. Our local health department is who we contract with in order to get birth certificates, and they help us with that. But we have to pay for that, and we send people there. They're accommodating and helpful, but they just moved, so that's a longer process.
Jennifer, could I ask another one? And I know you're a guest speaker, so I do this in a very humble fashion. But if you could, having seen it, if you could lay out wraparound services that are exactly available and how you do that, if there's any summation, that would be extremely helpful for us, because we are attempting to do a hub concept as part of our recommendation that we don't have today. And a city this size absolutely has to have that. And then it can be replicated throughout the state. But if you could provide that, that way we know that we're down the right path.
yeah, so what's
From a res-
on site, what's.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that would
Our
be very
MQHD,
helpful.
yeah.
Yeah.
I have a couple more questions, but I'm gonna probably do them in email out of interest of time. And I'll just tell you some of them, and you don't need to answer, but as you remember, we came with the deputy chief of police, and a lot of times IMPD and other police forces around the state don't have a place to take people,
No.
right? So that is one thing that I will put in an email. And then the other one is on wraparound services. Once you get them in housing, how do you keep them there from a funding standpoint, making sure they get poles, clock radios, all those things? That will be a second one. And then you're gonna take care of us on the hub. One last, just for this group. One thing that we have been talking about in our short-term immediate fix, where we're trying to attack the immediate, maybe by spring of 2023, knowing it's gonna take several years to do the longer low barrier structure like you're building is the potential of getting 60, 100, 150 people off the street immediately by literally buying units and creating our own inventory like that versus taking 2 to 3 years to build them. Just real quickly, your thoughts about the effectiveness of that, because we've talked about, if we get 60 people off the streets of downtown Indianapolis, I think Jeff would agree, and all of us, that would make an immediate impact. If we could get 100, even greater. So do you mind commenting on that? And then I think we got to keep moving.
No,
Thank you.
absolutely. And one of the things that we're working on right now is how to really figure out master leasing, what that looks like, and how do I bring in my leverage, my landlord as partners,
Yes.
to understand that they really, I don't want them to care about who the tenants are in there. Let me care about who they are, and let me figure out how to keep them there. So yes, housing ends for homelessness. And so as long as you're really looking at this housing as the first step in a system of care to keep them housed, because we can end anybody's homelessness. It's keeping them there.
Right.
That's a struggle. So once we get them in there, how do we keep them there? And we can't make them engage. These are voluntary services. I can't make them do something, but we can make them have conversations, like try to, we can
Right.
try to continue to knock on doors. I will tell you, I've seen my best leveraging when I've done it with peers and community health workers. It just is a different angle. And I think people, they're respecting their peers when they're coming to knock on their door and asking them. We've also do a lot with incentives. So when you talked about the clock radios, we give out a lot of crock pots sometimes. Because again, that gets the door open when you're able to provide them with something. We're here to build relationships, rapport, and they need to trust us. That's critical to any of this. And so the staffing model that you have that's going into someone's home is much different than the staffing model that you have at an emergency shelter. These are people that are here to be friends with them and support them in helping them. And they have to understand where they're at. And so that's what's critical.
Thank you.
Yes.
We very much appreciate you coming
Absolutely.
in.
Glad to
It
be
was
here.
very helpful
Anytime.
because
Anytime.
really what we're trying to do on the short term is very similar to your model.
Yeah.
Well, it's gonna take us a little time on the structure itself, but it sounds like you find that to be a very viable concept for us to go out and do master lease purchase, et cetera. Okay, so but thank you. And if you would follow up, we would all greatly appreciate it. So in the interest of time, Christine, since we're a little short on time, if we could just do 5 minutes on, and you'll.
That's okay.
Yeah. So to level this out, I think a brief discussion today to then allow you to bring back information to the group at the next meeting. Can we just talk about some of the challenges and if we can frame this, Jeff and I talked about this last night, that there's some perception that DOC simply in this, I'm just trying to be as fair as I can.
I know
Yeah.
exactly what you're gonna say.
Yeah, there's a perception that you have overwhelming numbers that come out, and as we all heard today, there's not a place to put them.
Right.
So we just want to try to, as you come back, understand what those numbers are, and then how this interrelates, so we don't have a large group of people coming to Wheeler Mission or somewhere else literally without a plan. So
Yeah,
if you-
so I didn't bring the data with me just because
Yeah, we
No,
understand.
But
We
this is what I want to say too. So I'll just start off by saying in the past 2 years, we have made tremendous progress on placements. I mean, I can't even tell you. And COVID had a lot to do with that. Do we still need help? Absolutely. Do we still have people that we struggle with finding placements? Absolutely. So, contrary to what some people believe, we do not just, every single incarcerated individual that's released from us has a plan. Now, whether it's a short-term plan, we don't just open the door and say, see ya, don't know where you're going, Prior to COVID, we had a lot more, the numbers were a lot higher on ones that would go to shelters and missions. Once COVID hit, it was like, this is not really an option anymore. Like these numbers have to be smaller. I mean, we can't you know, shelters were closing, missions weren't taking people, they were being used as quarantine centers, like, we didn't have, that wasn't a major option for us. So, we had to really dig in and start finding, alternative placements, you know, other friends, other families. Where can we send these people? We struggle with sex offenders. We do, have some hotels that we do put, some that we pay for a certain amount of time for those sex offenders, but it's not a permanent housing plan. I was telling him, we've probably reduced our number of shelter admission. Well, I know we have reduced our numbers of shelters and missions by over 50% since COVID. I mean, that's tremendous for us. But again, do we still need help? Yes. Do we still send some to shelters and missions? Yes. We're working real closely now with the Community Development, Housing and Community Development Authority, which I am so excited about. They've received a grant. They're helping us with the tenant-based rental assistance on some of these guys. I mean, if we are really in a bind, we email Victoria and she's like, this is what we're looking at here, helps us with, individual cases on occasion. That has been like a huge resource for us, been very, very helpful. We've been able to have, we're still sending some to shelters and missions, clearly. We still do some at some hotels when necessary. But again, that's still not long-term. It could be short-term. It could be a month, it could be a couple weeks. It just, but we still have to find other opportunities. For some of these guys. I just jotted down a couple notes I want to go over. I mean, I guess maybe what kind of questions like do you guys have?
So I think
For me.
one of them would be if you could help us with the data. I mean,
Okay.
just what are the numbers?
The numbers?
What
Okay.
are the numbers that we believe today are being placed and those that are not
Mhm.
being placed?
Yeah,
And then I think the second part, and others can add, is how can this task force and DOC work together with some of these initiatives
Mhm.
to work in unison to solve the DOC problem as well as the other problems that we've been talking about that can happen in downtown Indianapolis and then be replicated throughout the state?
yeah.
What is the best practice, if there is, in other states across the country or anything else? How can we incorporate this in the commission assessment? So I'll let
Okay.
anyone else jump in.
You touched on barriers to housing placements. I think
Mhm.
helping understand what the kind of array of issues that a person may face if they're going into a shelter versus into a housing placement. The task force may not be able to solve for those things, but if there are
Right.
funding needs that could go along with some of those specific populations, I think that's where we maybe look to our legislative partners as part of our.
The other problem is too, and I think I touched on this a little bit at the last meeting that we had, we have, we may have these, our employment rate for guys on parole especially is high. I mean, 80% of the, 80 to 90% of those guys that are on parole are working, but they can't find housing because nobody will rent to them because they won't rent to, place people that have felons. So that is a huge struggle too. I mean, I personally have someone that works directly for me that's a formerly incarcerated individual, and she makes decent money, and she cannot find a place to live because, I mean, I've had to help her call around. We've had to try to find an apartment that will rent to her, and just because she's a former felon, and so that is a huge struggle. So any help that we could get with that would be helpful.
Yeah, we've had to do some very intensive landlord engagement around criminal backgrounds and not having sort of blanket policies of not leasing to anyone with, a past conviction. And we've had some success, I think, depending on the nature of the offense. We haven't battled 1,000, but we've gotten landlords comfortable thinking differently about criminal background.
One of the things that we have found specifically with landlords, and I know that through GMHA, there's a landlord mitigation fund for people that have some challenges. utilizing that at the uptick. Like, so, when you're having that conversation with a landlord about, here's what we can offer, here's $1,000 incentive to retain this person in housing for 12 months. If there's property damage, we'll pay for up to 2 months worth of rent, we'll pay first month's rent, last month's rent, here's a bonus deposit, you know, whatever.
Work.
They do,
really do.
because ultimately, a landlord is protecting our property, right? And so that's what makes them nervous about it. And so when you come out with all of these opportunities, that does help lessen the blow for some. So it has helped.
Dustin, you were, and then Jack's next, sure.
I think some of it's the concern with like, are we overburdening Indianapolis with folks that aren't necessarily from Indianapolis, right? So are these inmates being released from non-Marion County inmates being released into Marion County because there's a perception that we have the ability to handle it, but we don't, right?
Yeah.
And so there's that. And then the second component would be like, how do we make sure if we're gonna move forward with a plan, how do we get good coordination for early, like if you've identified somebody that you know is getting released, how do we make sure that the folks in Indianapolis working on housing are alerted early so that that person can then go, have a place to go?
Oh,
you
yeah.
know? And so
Yeah.
how do we make sure that pipeline
Yeah,
and
yeah.
conversation?
Never really thought about your question of people from other counties being released in Marion County. It's an
Yeah.
interesting point.
And I mean, it does happen some, but it doesn't happen like, I mean, you know, we've heard the rumor that we pull up on a bus and drop off a bunch of people in Marion County. That is a rumor. That is not true. So I want to clarify that, you know,
Jack.
that doesn't happen.
Thank you, Jack. Go ahead. And then I think we need to move on.
So we heard that in Lafayette, you use a standards for behavior with landlords. Is there an opportunity for DOC to develop a standards for behavior for landlords as they're looking
Oh, yeah.
at places? So.
Sure, that would be awesome.
And then ICDA, I know I'm cheating because we do need to move on. Is there anything ICDA can do to require cooperation with DOC or other entities within the state as part of our grant? You don't have to answer, but I just throw it out there because it's just something to think about. Thank you. So I appreciate it. And then
Oh, yeah.
if we could follow up
Yeah.
with some more specific data and answer the questions that were raised, that would be great. So next on the agenda, yes.
Is it okay, really quick? I want to flag, and I know we do need to move along. But I think this conversation about landlord engagement and working with landlords, particularly for justice-involved individuals or people re-entering from incarceration, is worth flagging for the other task force that we've mentioned that there might be some overlap with. So, you know, there is a statewide affordable housing task force as well that I think there's some folks on this task force. I think Senator Codora, I think Jake Sipe sit on as well. And I know that some of what's being engaged in that discussion around out-of-state landlords and properties that have really, really large portfolios that use like third-party tenant applicant screening processes. Those are the ones that we tend to have the most challenges with in terms of working with us and with various populations, because they contract out their tenant application processes, which often screen out the exact kinds of folks that we're, you know, trying to get into housing. And when we're working with really large out-of-state landlords, you know, it's hard to kind of build these kinds of relationships and engage landlords in these conversations. And so I think this is a conversation that could be flagged for that task force to delve into as well. And I think some of those issues are being brought up.
Yeah, these are tough issues, but I think they deserve, you know, when you fund, sometimes when you get funding, there's requirements attached to that funding. So, all right, well, thank you. The next item, and I'm trying to move along the best we can here. Next item is the initial draft, and Jeff is going to walk us all through this. And, you know, based upon our conversation, I think everyone, as we're going through it, we both agree we're going to have to add specific data, specific information, some of the things we're talking about with DOC on ICDA. What can we do to spur greater inventory? You know, what can we do to get people housed where there's restrictions? So we have a lot to do, but Jeff put together a draft here, so.
And as
Jeff,
I
why don't you
was
fire away?
talking to Tom last night, this is an outline and it's a draft.
Yes, we got a lot of work.
So there is, you're going to see, that, there needs to be meat on the bones. This is just the bones. And for those of you that are on the phone, if you're at your computer at the same time you're on the phone, this is in your inbox if you want to follow along the slide deck as I go. And I realized I forgot to number the slides. So my apologies, even after we talked about last slide. So the purpose on slide 1 is simply taken from the charter, the legislation that created us as a group. Certainly, this is, Indianapolis is sort of the case study here, but what we're trying to do, what we've often reminded ourselves is we're trying to devise recommendations that can be replicated or applied across the state in small towns or counties that would like to, or cities that want to use these tools to address what is a very complex issue. So of course, we'll list all of the members' meeting dates. We'll attach the minutes and the link to the recordings that Mike is making of meetings. And then we'll begin to frame up the discussion sort of at a national level, but for a few notable exceptions, unsheltered homelessness has been a tricky issue nationwide. That our work is statewide in scope, but locally applicable, and we'll use some Indianapolis examples as part of the case study. We're also using Lafayette, and I'll show a Bloomington note here in just a minute. We will review the plans that we have discussed over the course of this group's meeting, going back to the very first meeting in February, where we kind of gave an overview of Indianapolis's community plan and homelessness as well as others. And then how this group's discussion has evolved over time. So we started out really talking about shelter, shelter, shelter. And I think this group, to its credit, has evolved that discussion to something that is much more of a housing continuum, where we do need shelter and emergency access points, and where there might be gaps in our system here locally at that level. But certainly there are gaps across the continuum, and Jennifer talked about them, I think, in the Lafayette case. Permanent housing and services and funding to support those.
And I think the other evolution is that we're going to have a short-term approach. What all can we get accomplished with the hub and other things in 23, and then have a long-term check.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I mean,
That's
what can we do to act as soon as possible on
Yes.
some of these issues, but not losing sight of the bigger
Yes.
picture, which really involves the creation of permanent housing, because that's the only way we're going to successfully address homelessness. So I've broken down part of the presentation around shelter and then permanent housing and services. So we do have an existing shelter ecosystem in Indianapolis, as there's an existing shelter ecosystem in other cities and counties across the state. Here, I think we can identify some certain gaps in the shelter ecosystem. There are people who won't go into shelter or can't go into shelter and may not go into a shelter that we provide through the work of this task force. But I think we have to acknowledge that there are gaps that exist. I think we need to define what is low barrier to us, because I think that is a different definition depending on who you ask.
I
Certainly,
like Jennifer's definition for the record.
I don't disagree. I think there are different definitions of what low barrier is, and we have not really settled on one. And then shelter needs to exit into housing if we're going to be successful in this work. Shelter is not the end, the destination for anybody that we're trying to serve. So there are low barrier, or at least lower barrier access points that currently exist, that have existed in the past, and that will exist in the future across the state. And this is not an exhaustive list by any means, just a few examples. In Indianapolis, until the pandemic hit, we had, I think it was 40 total beds, 30 were dedicated specifically for people experiencing homelessness at the Reuben Engagement Center. which was on East Market Street in a building that is now vacant but is owned by the city. That program moved just a few months ago to the Assessment Intervention Center, which is at our Community Justice Campus at Twin Air. It is not fully actualized and is not low barrier, I think, as this group would define low barrier. For example, smoking is not allowed, and a person has to be sober to go in. So there are some barriers that have been removed, but some barriers that still exist. Lafayette truly is a low barrier model and maybe something that we would strive to do. South Bend operates a municipal shelter in the city of South Bend. Bloomington operates one currently and is developing a new center based on the Lafayette model. I mean, almost identical in terms of even layout in a building with multiple floors where there are tax credit units in the building, but a day center and an emergency, series of emergency beds that they're trying to figure out how to fund. So I think we want to acknowledge
So
that.
one point in this whole thing is, if you look at that list, Indianapolis, downtown Indianapolis doesn't have a true low barrier location, which is pretty amazing. And no offense to the AIC, please don't take it.
It's not downtown.
It's not downtown, but it's also in a judicial center. And it's tough to get, I've talked to enough people, it's tough to get people to go to a judicial center. So this does show we have a big gap here that we don't have the true sense low barrier. So I just wanted to highlight that point. Go ahead.
The idea of the co-located navigation center, day center, housing hub, one-stop shop, I think we've settled on as a really important feature of whatever we do. It just so happens that in Indianapolis, Horizon House serves as the day center, and they are, as Teresa reported a couple meetings ago, interested in demonstrating the housing hub concept under their roof. They would like to expand their services to more like 12 hours a day, 7 days a week if they can. So not a 24/7 model, but certainly expanded compared to what they have available currently. And then permanent housing. So again, I think we have to keep reminding ourselves that all the work that we're doing to connect with people has to lead to permanent housing. And the unit pipeline is really important. And we can't deliver enough units fast enough to meet the need. And that, if we could snap our fingers and have, plus or minus 600 units available overnight, we could literally house everybody who's on our coordinated entry list in Marion County.
Think about that. I mean, that's a big number. 600 people are waiting for houses.
See, I don't think it's that big of a number. I think it's a number that you can actually do the math around, but being able to access the tax credit program to finance the units. The master leasing concept of going out and just getting control of, a couple hundred units right away. The landlord incentives piece that we talked about, those incentives work, and they work for all kinds of populations. And then we have to have a way to pay rent, especially for that cohort of people that's going to need permanent rental assistance in the services. We just have to make sure that we're always thinking about units, rent, and services, and the funding that's needed for each one. So that's where we go to next. The next slide is the services and support and service providers slide. None of this stuff is sustainably funded or permanently funded. We cobble together resources for each of these things and it's really year to year at best. In some cases, it's 6 months to 6 months trying to make sure you've got enough funding to have adequate, robust, professional street outreach. That's not a job for volunteers. It's a job for professionals And ideally professionals that have medical backgrounds as well as, just crisis intervention backgrounds.
But this is an example, as we're talking about, where we gotta dig in and say, how many people do we need? What is that funding that we need to address that,
Yeah,
as well as the hub and all that?
people and the operating model for street outreach.
Yeah.
Just doing street outreach 9 to 5, Monday through Friday is not good enough. And, you know, in Indianapolis, having a model that can maybe ebb and flow with staff at peak times, and sometimes the peak times are weekends, and the peak times are nighttime. We don't really, and I don't think we've ever really successfully modeled what street outreach should look like, and I think.
And who operates it?
Right, because right now, street outreach here is disparate. Different agencies have different employees who do outreach. Now, we have an umbrella where they all sort of come under an umbrella of Horizon House, but their paychecks are signed by different agencies, and that doesn't always lead to the best service delivery. I'm not sure how it works in a city like Lafayette, but we've never really struck gold on how to do street outreach right way here. The housing hub, I think we talked about a lot. Expanded hours, expanded days per week, bringing the right services under that roof and trying to limit the amount of sending away to different buildings as much as we can. That has a cost to it that Horizon House is helping us to discern. Our service providers who provide supportive services to keep people housed are stretched paper thin. They're struggling with hiring and training and retention. And so we're at a point in Indianapolis where we have funds to give to service providers that they will not take because they're afraid they won't be able to deploy the funds. And so that's something that maybe this task force will be able to address directly, but with the help of state agency partners, maybe we could over time. We do cobble together local sources in Marion County to provide services funding, and this is and thanks to IACDA and their partnership, we're able to use our Housing Trust Fund to provide supportive services funding, and that's been really successful in helping maintain a high level of housing retention. And then we have a philanthropic fund that was created in 2019 in partnership with CICF, Central Indiana Community Foundation, that provides services funding alongside our Housing Trust Fund. And so then we talk about Medicaid, which we have, and there are multiple recommendations in the IHCDA crosswalk report. I think many of them devised by the Corporation for Supportive Housing. And I think implementing those recommendations is something that we need to reiterate. So we get into the recommendations part of the report. I have broken down the recommendations by sort of shelter, housing, and services, but I think as Tom and I have discussed and we've discussed today, there's probably a way to break them down by short-term, long-term as well. So maybe within each of these.
Particularly from a funding standpoint. I think
Right,
so.
and for discussions with legislators and potential funding partners, knowing what we can do now if we have funding versus what we'd like to do over time if we have funding, I think is an important piece of this. So, you know, the Assessment Intervention Center is not perfect, as we've discussed, and it's not in a great location, but it has available empty space. Yes. And so does it make any sense at all to try to activate some of that space in a low barrier type pilot project? Pending operating model, who would run it? I think those are questions we need to answer. But if we wanted to demonstrate proof of concept on something that is lower barrier than we currently have, that may be a space in which to do it that we already own. We've discussed supporting Horizon House already, and I think it makes perfect sense to go in with them on phase 1 and the beginning of maybe phase 2 of their housing hub concept, which would be low cost, low risk, but potentially high return.
In a fast, quick
Yeah,
fashion.
right. You can do that in the next, 120 days. we want to make sure we're addressing the gaps in housing that the DOC faces and those needs, as we kind of lay out the data there. Our shelter concept may not be the best way to meet those needs, and we want to make sure we're addressing those needs in the right way. We need to use our networks to make sure we've got the right agencies participating in the housing hub, either on-site or close by, but on-site ideally. So
Your list.
that list,
Right.
and if our work can bring the B and B mobile unit or whatever to your location, I think all the better.
Yeah, I think your list, it should be who you have and who you
Who I
want to
wish-
have,
Yes,
right?
that's right.
Because maybe we can leverage.
Yeah, that's it. I think that's a good
Help
idea.
you too, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I will bet that the cross section between Horizon House's list and Lafayette's list is.
I mean, we even have the mobile unit that has DOC, so that would be huge to be able to.
I just don't know that we've ever really made that formal connection.
Yeah. Yeah, they've been a huge conference recently.
Yeah, and, just pull up in the parking lot on Tuesdays or whatever. Maybe cut some trips out. So master leasing, I think is a short-term action item that we could undertake with, potentially with some funding help. But, if we could go out and get control over, say, 150 units, like the math on that's pretty easy to do. And then it just becomes a question of sources of funding. And I think a 2-year pilot project is enough to really get some proof of concept for how this might work.
And maybe there's some DOC help inside these numbers as we start to grow that to help.
For us in Indianapolis, these early action item recommendations will continue to be site search and get site control of real estate. If we're going to build permanent supportive housing and or integrate emergency beds into permanent supportive housing, we need the space to do it. And so we continue working with our broker. We have either made an offer on one piece of property, if not soon, we would make an offer on one piece of property, but that shouldn't be the only place that we try to acquire. And I think
Then we should contemplate, like we talked about, on the permanent, long-term approach.
that's right.
Yes.
That's right. And integration of permanent supportive housing and shelter under one roof, like Lafayette or Bloomington are doing. Those permanent supportive units are tax credit fundable. And I think we can work together to devise the operating funding for those unfunded parts of such development. But in order to do that, we need to make sure that we're incentivizing participation, for example, in ICD's Permanent Supportive Housing Institute. And Matt and Jake, I don't know if this is a viable recommendation to seek additional funding for the 4% bond program, but.
Right, well, there's two possible sides, right? So there's the federal advocacy of that there should just be more bonds made available through Treasury, right? And then the second possible recommendation, so theoretically, the task force could take out is to say that of the volume that the state does get from the federal government, that a higher percent should go to IHCA for housing. We get about 48%. Yes, to us. It's either 44 or 48% of the state's volumes come to IHCA.
The state has, for the first time, making a huge investment into affordable housing through a state tax credit.
Right.
If there was an enhancement to that tax credit to either increase it specific for permanent supportive housing, could be another option to create a state tax credit. Says 5-10 million of the state tax credit needs to go to create supportive housing.
So since DOC has a task, Jennifer's been so kind, could the two of you help on that potential recommendation that we can talk about? I've been talking to Jeff. Is there any other thing we can do to incentivize developers as we try to catch up? Hopefully we'll catch up someday, but what else can we do? So, all right, keep going.
And then lastly, the supportive services funding piece. So it seems unlikely that the state would provide a permanent source of funding for local street outreach operation, like annual operation of a low barrier shelter, low barrier access point, or supportive services, generally speaking. But if there was a way to at least provide some bridge funding while the Medicaid crosswalk implementation, recommendation, are being implemented, like, that's what we're trying to do with philanthropic dollars in Marion County, but we don't quite have enough. The other localities probably don't have any philanthropic bridge funding. If they do, it's not $10 million. So mapping out that the Medicaid waivers are going to take years. You know, I've heard 3 years, I've heard 5 years, I don't know what it is, but it's gonna be years. So if we have a 2-year budget coming up, could there be some bridge funding built into that 2-year budget that Lafayette could tap, that Bloomington could tap, that South Bend could tap, that other places could?
I can tell you, I'll be really disappointed if that's not the case, but.
And then we bridge to Medicaid, and then we deal with the complexities of Medicaid building when we get to that bridge. And then to answer, like, who does the work, I think there has to be a recommendation in this report that brings universities and Ivy Tech online to help us recruit, hire, train, maintain employees to do this work, whether they're BSW, MSW social workers, or more technical experts who maybe come through a 2-year program at Ivy Tech who can work with the search.
Yeah, no, Tim had brought that up. And so Tim, since we're doing homework, if there's anything that you want to do to expand on that concept, that would be great for the group.
So,
I don't know.
Go ahead, Chelsea.
I was gonna say, Tim and I have actually had several conversations since the last task force meeting on this. And we're happy to continue working. There's already some really exciting precedents set through Community Health Network that did a behavioral health academy to increase the talent pipeline here in Indiana for licensed clinical social workers. That we're talking with them about what would it look like to expand that? What kind of investment, what kind of incentives in terms of loan forgiveness or something. So we've kind of like tagged ourselves on continuing to pursue that.
Okay, well, if you could take that to the next step with a kind of a concise recommendation that can come to the commission, that would be great. Thank you.
Thanks.
I was just gonna say, you know, as we put together this final report, I think it's gonna be very important, that first bullet point there, that there gets to be quite a bit of specificity on what the recommendation is, because if it's just a recommendation to say, we'd like to see some legislation for funding for services, what you may get is something that defines services in a way you don't like, or narrowly says the money's flowing to the community mental health centers, not again to broad claims.
We totally agree.
We're gonna have to think really carefully about how do we define services, what state agency is going to be the path through the agent of the money, and then who ultimately can land that.
Oh, yeah. We talked about it last time.
So this is a draft and it's an outline. And if there are things that I have just completely misrepresented or missed entirely, don't hesitate to let me know now or upcoming.
So I have a few thoughts. I've been signature on. So I'm with FSSA's Division of Mental Health and Addiction specifically. So I have a broader knowledge of some broader FSSA level pieces, Medicaid pieces, but my wheelhouse is the mental health and addiction piece. For one, with this particular slide, I have to go back to Jennifer's presentation and highlighting peers and community health workers.
Yes.
So definitely want to make sure that we noted the importance of sort of the direct support staff.
Yeah.
At supportive services, and that, I mean, because these are folks who don't necessarily even require a college level education, right? And are the largest workforce we have. And so, yes, highlighting that specifically. The other thing I've been chewing on, so DMHA did put out an RFP earlier this year for low barrier shelter statewide. It's still sort of in the process, so I can't say too much about it, but what I can say is that I was part of that committee. There were some recommendations made that we're hoping SBA sort of moves forward with that might fund a couple of ones in development in other places of the state, not Indy. But the thing that makes me think about it for this conversation is the bridge funding piece. So we are tiptoeing with this idea of pursuing funding through the HCS steering committee. So Home and Community-Based Services received tons of money from the feds that has landed with FSSA. I'm still kind of learning about some of this. I had a meeting about it yesterday, but we are actually proposing or trying to see if it's possible to fund an additional proposal to move RFF, the Low Bear Shelter proposal through that committee. Waiting to see right now if it qualifies, right? Because they have sort of a set of services that come down from the feds as well, that have to check boxes and things like that. So that's something that I'm kind of curious about on my end, maybe following up on how it ties to this, especially as you talk about the bridge funding piece. Because many of us know that I think SBA's concern is like sustainability, right? So this plan with Medicaid down the line is a great on the longer term, but there might be some other pieces that could inform this conversation.
Yeah, if you have any thoughts, it would be great to get them to the group.
Okay.
We appreciate that.
I'll follow back up on the FSSA ACS funding piece, to kind of learn what's going on there, where there might be some.
Are those ARPA funds?
I don't know. I'll say that. I think so. I'm pretty sure, which I know there's some stipulations there, but there are lots of projects that are happening through that funding that I think surprise people, in terms of what's being allowed. So, I need to dig a little bit more into that.
Thank you.
So I think our next steps, which is the last item on the agenda, is some, I guess we talked about, now we gotta put some meat on the bones. We need to reorganize a little bit on short term, long term. We need to get that information from all the groups. We talked about IHCDA, Chelsea's group, DOC, FSA, SSA could help us. That would be great. So I think our next step is to move forward with a second draft and,
Yeah, essentially taking this outline and beginning to fill in beneath each of the broader
correct, with more
topics.
specifics of dollars.
Yeah, and that's where my sort of lack of knowledge of the state fiscal process will be a weakness. So Matt, your point about identifying the appropriate agencies where funding might be parked and flow through is going to be important and a little bit out of my wheelhouse.
Is before we wrap up, just for the group, I think it'd be helpful, Jack, Justin, if you could maybe give the group a little bit of context in terms of the task force coming up with information. The hope was that we could create specific information to do some initial lobbying to the State House in November. That's what I've spoken to some people about. I know you've done the same, Jack, all of you guys. So I guess the question, Fatty, and the others is, give us a sense of the timing of the state process, that if we can get these numbers out, there in November in a draft form, let's just talk about that timing as it relates to the state budget. I know it's complex, so if any of the three of you would take this on, I'd love it.
I'll just say December 7th and 9th, in the sense of our powerhouse. You give us December 31st and get things done.
I'd say August.
Yeah, but I think and Representative Lyon on the House side, he's a leader on this space too. But I will say this, I think from a legislative perspective, LSA does not like to have bills. I think the deadline is first week of December to place and the bill idea with LSA for them to draft it, so that hopefully they can go back and forth with us on iterations before Christmas. And then filing deadline is first week of session.
Yeah, that's what
But we can get a concept in with LSA, and then you can give us more
I got you.
minutes to it.
We can go
Yeah.
on that route.
We have-
Okay.
Well, and through the governor's office, I mean, the budget agency certainly can provide,
Right.
Information preliminarily. I mean, if they have an outline of what the report's going to say, they can start looking in context and putting numbers to that outline.
Yeah, so I've talked to Hammond and Earl about it, and that's kind of what our, at least the thought is Hammond would like to get involved in November. Then we'll sit down with Earl, and Earl's good with that.
Yeah.
Even said, I think Secretary Chambers wanted to get briefed on it as well. Then after that, all of us, I think then the next step is the speaker. And he's aware of that hopefully November. And I know I don't know exactly how your discussion went, but that's great. You talked to him. So then, hopefully by November, that would give you guys time in December to do what you need to do. Does that sound like a reasonable plan?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, this came about from a lot of work we did in the State House on this topic, and we weren't sure where it would go. We just kind of had this idea, let's put everybody in a room and
Yeah, that's great.
see where it goes, and
You guys did a great job setting it up.
Thanks. I feel really good about where you guys have taken it. I mean, I think this is some really actionable things that we can do, that are not too far fetched for the state to try to tackle anything.
Well, you got a new chairman in Ways and Means.
Yeah.
Brian Mitchell is the guy in the Senate. We can reach out, suggest this is coming, but I mean, it's really gonna be the governor's proposal based upon the report. And, so, what the ask is from the executive will make a big difference on how it's perceived.
Sure.
And
I mean, that's everything I'm being told is it's gonna have, lots of support top to bottom. So you guys understand that. I'm just getting it from the people that I mentioned, but hopefully we can be successful.
I have two quick comments. First, I think, just the political reality of the General Assembly. We have, my colleagues on the Republican side are more influential in getting legislation done. So I feel I'm eager to work with Senator Sanders to be sure that this is a bipartisan legislation that we can celebrate in both the House and the Senate. I don't think I think we can successfully usher that through both chambers and 4 caucuses. So I'm really looking forward to working with Senator Sanders on this. But the second point, which was mentioned earlier, I didn't want to comment on it, that while we are super laser focused today on this topic, Jake brought up the point about the state investment in the housing tax credits. There's an overlap between this laser focused initiative and the housing task force, which I serve on. And so I serve on both, and recommendations, some of them on the housing task force side will probably deal with housing tax credits, will deal with a bunch of policy issues, including housing TIFs. Jeff will talk about that, all of that. So I think I highly recommend for the co-chairs of this committee, of this task force, to have, meet with Representative Doug Miller and Senator Linda Rogers, who are the 2 co-chairs of that task force, and see if there's an alignment between both, so that the recommendations that will come out of both will kind of, converge into.
Is there a way that you could help hook the 2 of us up, maybe through an email or whatever? That would be helpful.
Another thought, and I think you were referencing maybe some of this when you're talking about the summit action that's in Friday as well. I would recommend that this also review the behavioral health commission report that came out. Absolutely. If you haven't already, to see where some of the things we're talking about align, because I feel like that's been well received. There's some, not necessarily housing specific, but certainly behavioral health, criminal justice, crossover, 980. We will build out pieces that, with our easy grabs that connected to what we were talking about.
Because we've tried not to reinvent the wheel on this group, and so the more we can reference plans that are actionable, the better. I think for all of us.
and it's a great read, it really is.
Pretty too, actually. It's available online, but I can send them.
All right. Always try to figure out a way to do this in an hour, and I've never been successful. So we're at an hour and a half, but I think we have a productive discussion. So thank you, everybody. Any other comments before we adjourn?
We meet, I believe, the day before Thanksgiving, so I apologize for that, but that's I think the best we can do with calendar coordination. So let us know if you can.
Thank you.
Will there be a virtual option for that?
There's a phone-in option.
A phone-in.
Yes.